Well, thank you so much, everybody that's here joining us. I'm Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. I'm a perinatal psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and I'm so excited tonight to be here with Dr. Kelly Fradin, who is a pediatrician in New York City and wrote the wonderful book, Parenting in a Pandemic, which I know has been such a helpful resource over the past, 7 or 8 months now. I've heard from so many parents who have read your book and really felt like the tips and advice that you've given about how to think about the data that's coming out during this pandemic and how to make decisions as a parent has been so helpful. So I'm really excited to be here tonight with you, Kelly.
Thanks so much. It's been such a challenging time for everyone that, the need to write the book and put content out there to help people is just so urgent that it really has been a passion project of mine over the past few months to try to do anything I can to help, because we all are just muddling through the best we can.
Yes, that is certainly true. And well, tonight, what we're going to be talking about is the holidays, which I know is on everyone's mind right now. All of my patients are asking me questions about what they should do, how to make these different decisions about Thanksgiving, the December holidays, everything coming up. And so I thought that this would be the perfect occasion to kind of sit down and have more of a deep dive about how parents can be thinking about the data in terms of risk. And if you are going to be traveling, or if you have decided that you do want to try and safely get together with some of your family, like, are there ways that we can do that responsibly? How should we be thinking about some of these things? And for folks that are listening in or watching, please feel free to put your questions in the comments, and I will be reading them and we'll be able to answer them too. So why don't we kind of start with Kelly, sort of how you've been talking to some of your patients about how to think about the holidays and handle that.
Right. So, sometimes the media about coronavirus have us thinking that like every day is something new and we still don't know a lot. And while we don't have certainty about the long-term side effects of coronavirus or exactly how effective some of the new therapeutics are, we do at this point know who is the highest risk from coronavirus. And I think most people have a sense of that by now, if you fall into that bucket or not. So just as we have been for months now recommending, people who are older need to be taking more precautions. People who have chronic conditions, especially, neurologic conditions or conditions affecting their heart, need to be more cautious. Cancer or people who are on immunosuppression. So those are the people who need to approach the holidays with the most caution. And of course, the family members of those people also need to be taking precautions to protect them. We call it cocooning when it's about a newborn baby, but the same concept applies to protecting your grandma. That we want to surround them with layers of healthy people to keep them from getting coronavirus. So as we think about our risk, we think about who in our family is at high risk. And now that so many of us are back at work or school, we also have to think about our bigger pod or our bubble. And you may not know everything about those people, but we have a commitment that we've made to those people that we interact with on a regular basis. So we have to honor that commitment and kind of live up to the expectations of those people we're mixing with on a regular basis. For my family, my husband and I, my 2 kids were lower risk, but we're taking every precaution, both to protect our elderly relatives and to protect our schools when we return. We'll probably have to quarantine after we see family, but for us, we think about the benefits of seeing family as well as the risks. So we all are balancing those pros and cons as we approach these decisions. The last thing you can't forget to think about is the worst case scenario. So for some people, the idea of a lockdown is kind of the biggest deterrent to exposing yourself to coronavirus. Like, imagine that you do go see some family and your child gets sick with coronavirus. At a minimum, you're looking at 10 days for your child before your child can return to school. But then once your child is no longer contagious, that's when your 14-day period of quarantine begins. So for a lot of us, we also have to think about, not just the illness, but also like the impact of that isolation. A lot of people's jobs and lives and social emotional engagement in their community. 24 days is a long time to isolate. So we also want to avoid the practical strain that would impose.
Right. So much of this kind of comes back to trying to figure out and balance the risks versus the potential benefits. And I do think that there's something to be said for the benefits. Like I have a patient right now who's about, a month postpartum, and she's dealing with all of those normal new mom feelings around how much your identity changes when you become a new mom, just the drudgery of taking care of an infant, sort of the Groundhog Day nature of it. And and her family lives across the country, or her husband's family lives across the country, I'm sorry, and her family lives driving distance, and typically they spend Thanksgivings with her husband's family, but they don't feel comfortable getting on a plane right now. So it's kind of like, well, is it worth the risk for them to drive so that they could potentially spend some time with her family, because it's going to actually be really, really good for her mental health to have some of that sense of community and that sense of normalcy, versus them spending the holiday alone and kind of having another feeling of like, oh, we have a newborn, so we can't do anything. So sort of, I think, balancing some of those risks and looking at what could the potential benefits be, and is there a way to do that safely? And of course, like you said, so much of that depends on the health of your family members, whether that's elderly family members, or the health of your kids as well, if you have a kid in your family that has a chronic medical condition. Do you have thoughts about driving versus plane travel? I know you probably get asked this all the time.
Yeah, definitely. It's been confusing to sort through the data, because some of the data that's out there about plane travel has been paid for and brought to you by the airline industry. And so sometimes we have to approach that with a grain of salt, because we know that they have intense motivation to keep it going. That said, there was a study summarized in NPR today. I actually shared it with some of my Instagram followers about Hong Kong has been doing intense screening of incoming flights from Dubai, I think. And it's these 8-hour flights. They PCR test everybody before and 14 days following. So they're testing everybody. They're not missing anybody. And the studies actually showed that transmission is pretty rare. Over a month of monitoring every single flight, they had 58 cases of people who got on board as positive, and no transmission from those cases. Then they did have one flight where 27 people on board happened to have coronavirus. And on that flight, 2 people caught it. So the risk from, that 8-hour flight where masking was heavily enforced seems lower than you might expect, given that you're in a small confined space for a long period of time. I mean, they say the ventilation in the plane is good. They use high-grade filters. They get the air from outside. But I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised by that. I think what I don't like about air travel is that you give up your ability to control who you're around. You just kind of just pick of the lottery who you're next to, and that could be a really responsible, conscientious person, or it could be someone who refuses to mask or is shirking their responsibilities and traveling while waiting for their test results to come in or something like that. So I do think if you're going to travel, to use the best mask you have access to. If some of the K95s are available now online, or at least a surgical mask over a cloth mask, which may provide a higher level of protection. To be especially cognizant of the before and after part of flying, security and the crowds or lines around the travel. And I do prefer if people who can mask fly, rather than families with young children who can't mask, just because that mask Even a cloth mask, it says to block like between 70 and 80% of the incoming germs. That's a real like line of defense for you. So I think it makes sense to have people who can mask appropriately be the ones to take the travel on.
Right. So if you have toddlers or younger kids that are not going to be able to mask or reliably mask, then it would be a lot harder, riskier for you and riskier for the other folks on the plane as well to be traveling on the plane. And it might make more sense if you can to drive, even if it's a longer distance.
Yeah, I think so. And I think driving is probably better if it's feasible because you can control your route and where you stop and who you see. But one thing that gets glossed over a little bit is that whether you fly or drive, you do have to consider the community you're coming from and where you're going to. New York City and New York has very strict rules about where you can go and how you have to quarantine when you come back. And that list of places that are approved is always changing. So I know we're always looking at that list as we consider what plans are feasible. But when you are returning from travel, you're going to have to abide by whatever rules are laid out in your community, whether the government or the schools, which sometimes can be a little stricter.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that came up in the Facebook group actually was this question about quarantining and when to get tested, like how long you should wait to get tested. I know I'm seeing some folks that are getting tested, the day of exposure or potential exposure, suspected exposure, but then we're seeing other health experts saying that you should wait at least 5 days. Then other people are saying wait 2 weeks. What do you suggest? And is it different based on when you should get tested if you're returning from somewhere or traveling somewhere versus if you're getting tested based on a potential suspected exposure?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And we do have some information about it at this point, which is that if you're exposed, say you're exposed on the 5th, if you get tested in the first 3 days, like the 6th, 7th, 8th, you're going to test negative from that exposure. You simply won't have had enough time to have enough virus that can be detected. So there's probably no purpose in testing before that time. It may like falsely reassure you and make you think that you're safe when in fact you could be about to enter what we refer to as like the pre-symptomatic phase where you have virus, but maybe you don't have any symptoms yet. So most people start to develop symptoms after day 5, but sometimes not until day 12 after exposure. So that's why we have this 14-day window of quarantine. But if you look, even day 5, when symptoms typically begin, you'll miss like up to 40% of cases who will eventually have coronavirus. So they say even 2 days after your symptoms begin is the best day to obtain testing, so closer to day 7. So I think for a lot of people who are trying to cut their periods of isolation or quarantine as short as possible, it makes sense to isolate for as many, say you have an exposure, maybe you do that family reunion with 60 people and know you're taking a big risk, but by seeing more than you should, or whatever it is, you have an exposure, you wait as long as you can towards that 14 days. Maybe it's 5 days, maybe it's 7 days, maybe it's 9 days. The more days, the better. You get the test. And then at that point, you can be more reassured. You also have to know what kind of testing is available in your community and what the turnaround time is for that, because some places I'm hearing people still have to wait, 2, 3, 4 days to get the results. And you want to make sure that you're waiting for the results to be back before you leave your period of isolation or quarantine.
Right. I think here in DC, it's still like 2 or 3 days to get results back. So yeah. Okay, so that's helpful. Somebody wrote on the chat, what if you're traveling on the plane? What if you're someone who's traveling on the plane and you're going to see or visit someone who's high risk? Would driving be a marginally better option in that case?
So I guess the interesting thing about it is that it depends a little bit on the length of your visit, because say you've been very locked down before travel and you are exposed in the flight. If you're only going to be there for 2 or 3 days And then you may actually not have a chance to become infectious while you're there. The longer you're there, the more likely that flight or travel exposure matters. So you should consider that too. I do think it's probably marginally safer to travel by driving if it's available. But, I would encourage people also to factor in their well-being, because sometimes driving can, especially if you're tired or, driving through the night to get somewhere, your safety matters too. So some of these decisions where the risk is pretty similar, you definitely should factor in those lifestyle kind of safety concerns as well.
Right, right. And where are you going to be stopping? What options do you have to stop? Who will you be seeing during those stops, if anybody? And how confident are you in anyone that you might see on the long drive that they're going to be kind of adhering to their own protocols, and how strict are those folks going to be? Things like that. So it does feel like with all of these different decisions, it's so complicated. There's so much kind of calculus to balance. And I think one thing that's hard, obviously, with the holidays is in a lot of areas of the country, it's cold out now in comparison to the summer. So if you're getting together for Thanksgiving, in a lot of parts of the country, that's going to mean being indoors. And I think a lot of us have taken comfort, at least here on the East Coast, of being able to spend so much time outside and feel relatively low risk, relatively safe if we're doing things socially distanced with masks outside. That sort of feels like you're taking all the precautions, you're doing everything that you can. But by the end of November, that's going to mean, here, at least here on the East Coast, that's going to mean getting together inside. Do you have any recommendations? If folks are traveling and they're going to be doing Thanksgiving, if they're going to be staying like with family in their house, should they be wearing masks? Should they be trying to social distance? Or if you're staying with your family, is there even any point to doing that?
It's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on the specifics. Obviously, if you were going to be sleeping in the same room, overnight, you're not going to be masking. And that's like 8 or 10 hours of being in a small space that's maybe not so well ventilated. It probably is going to be, you're mixing your germs anyway at that point. But if you're not sleeping in the same environment, I do think there's a point to making an effort to decrease the load. One of the interesting things people talk about in terms of, we're seeing that the death rates from coronavirus are coming down a little bit, that people aren't getting, even people who are as at risk or as old who are getting coronavirus now are not having quite a severe course. And they think that's for multiple reasons. We're getting better at our treatment protocols. But one of the reasons they're thinking that too is that the masks decrease your load of virus. So there's this idea that if you get a big dose, you will get sicker with coronavirus than if you get a little dose. So anecdotally, we've seen where early on, before healthcare providers all had N95s and all the good stuff that they have now, we saw some people who were doing those procedures in the airway, the intubations, getting really sick. And now we think that maybe some of that was because they were getting big doses of virus at one time. So I think it is possible that by trying to social distance and mask when you're with family, that even if you do get sick, you may not actually get as sick. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's a purpose to it, but like with everything, it's about that balance. So if you're so anxious enforcing these rules that you can't enjoy the time with your family, maybe you're crossing into a line where it's like not worth it. There's always other options, either not going, scheduling it for when the weather's nicer, doing something virtually. And if you feel like, I think that sense of having to be hyper vigilant about your plan, I see all the time moms at the playground who are trying to enforce their children staying distanced from other children. And I think that creates a lot of stress for the moms and the kids, because it's like a constant evaluation and intervention. Whereas when kids can mask, and maybe you're worried less because they're masked about them being too close for a few minutes, because of course the kids are moving all over the place at the playground, you can relax a little bit, like they have their mask on, and then kind of decrease that constant monitoring policing that you have to do. It can be more enjoyable.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think even thinking about if you do visit family, if they're, if it's going to be for a couple days, potentially having a bubble within that, maybe if it's that just one or two people that you will have more close contact with. But then if there's going to be a larger group, trying to have that outside or having that really be socially distanced, or, kind of different gradations of how much exposure there is. I really like your point about the fact that that this is all it's not all or nothing. It's not black and white. So each little precaution that you take can potentially add up. And I think that that's really helpful and important, especially when we think about like this whole pandemic fatigue thing that we're all experiencing, where it's sort of like we're just constantly having to make so many decisions all the time. And it's so easy to want to just like throw your hands up and just be like, oh gosh, I can't take it anymore. I'm just gonna do whatever. But if you really remember that, yeah, you might get sick, but you might get less sick, which is actually really important too. So I think that that's helpful. I feel like folks aren't really talking about that as much in terms of how to reduce risk. I'm going to look and see here. Question about, let's see, thoughts on family getting tested days before visits. Would this be futile given what you just spoke about regarding when to test?
Yeah, so one thing I just want to bring up that I didn't mention before is the difference between the antigen test and the PCR test. So it's a little confusing since there are rapid PCR tests and normal PCR tests. So Abbott in particular has like a rapid PCR test that you may have access to through your Department of Health, or if you have like a big hospital system. But those antigen-based rapid tests are not quite as accurate as the PCR tests, because they skip like a technical amplification stage. So the antigen-based tests are what the president was using with his plan before he got sick. So obviously there's a possibility of missing someone either early in the illness or in that period between when they're exposed and about to be symptomatic. I think so I would urge you to be cautious about the way that you're using testing and to include the doctor in the plan, because they can help you make sure that the plan makes sense for your family. But if you're going to test in a precautionary way, please use the PCR test, because that's the more accurate one. Though, that's the one that in DC, I guess 2 to 3 days. In New York, there's a lot of places you can get it back same day right now, but I'm sure there will be surges around the holidays of people trying to get tested. Might slow things down.
Okay, that's really helpful. Yeah. Let's see. So someone's asking, if you think wearing masks inside could be helpful for your family, how do you have that conversation with your family? That's a great question. And I think that really hits on this most difficult piece of the holidays. How do you set boundaries? How do you have these hard conversations when you know that you might be met with pushback? I think that the most important thing is you have to be clear on what you want and what you would like to see, because you're not asking, if you go into the conversation asking for permission, then it's going to be much more difficult for your family that is responding to you. You don't want it to turn into an argument, right? You want it to be something where you're kind of like, look, I've thought this through. I've talked with our children's doctor. I've talked to my own doctor, and we've done a lot of reading about this, and we want to make sure that we are all getting together as safely as possible, and that we're really doing as much as we can to minimize the chances of spreading the infection within our family. And so one of the ways that we've come up with that we think is going to work the best for us is if we can all wear masks, even when we're inside. And I think you have to be just very firm about it and say that this is something that our family has decided is a precondition to us all meeting together. Now, if that's your precondition, you also have to be willing to enforce it. So you have to kind of decide beforehand, if they say no, is that a deal breaker for you? And I think that's what's tough about it, that that's not something that, you know, nobody else can really tell you what the answer to that question is. It's really something that you have to talk about with your own partner and decide, is it still worth it for us to take this risk, to take the risk of exposure if they're not willing to meet those conditions. And it's not potentially just the masks, you know, there's going to be other things too. Maybe it means doing some testing, or maybe it means quarantining, or whatever kind of plan you come up with. You want to see that your family is putting in a good faith effort to meet those conditions.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm talking to people about the conversations that you have even before you set those limits, because sometimes there's a lot of people whose families are way across the spectrum with risk tolerance. So some people know that before they go in there, this is going to be a difficult conversation. And sometimes I think it can be helpful to ask the open-ended questions of your family members, you know, like, I'm really worried about Dad, have you thought about this? Like, is there anything your family is going to do differently to protect him? Have you, like, what's your exposure like? What do you think the risk of you guys bringing it is going to be like? And sometimes by opening the dialogue about it a little bit before you set the limit, you can learn about the values and preferences of the other people. And they may surprise you. Even if they're people who haven't been taking it so seriously, they may have thought of a plan for ways in which they can make it safer. And so I think giving them a chance to voice their ideas matters too, and sometimes can help motivate them to find like a middle ground. But I absolutely agree with you. I think especially for new parents, that having the confidence to establish your limits can be really difficult. I think normally, you know, a lot of times family members who are older or more experienced with babies may tell you about feeding or sleep training. And it's just like, it can be hard to process all those opinions. And now we have like this novel situation and you have to kind of make up your own decisions about this. And it's even more difficult. So I think it's also okay if it takes a few conversations. So you may have like the preliminary conversation where you're trying to like motivate and assess how seriously your family's taking this, and then be like, let me think about this and get back to you. Like, I want to make sure we have a plan that makes me feel safe, because like in the end of the day, you deserve to feel safe and you deserve to like have your family support what you need. And sometimes you might not know right away, but that doesn't make it less important.
I love that. I think it's a really good suggestion to have this be something that it's not just one conversation, that it's kind of an ongoing process to kind of be curious and sort of understand where they're coming from, kind of like taking their temperature, getting a sense to start before you kind of set the limit. And by taking their temperature too, maybe that'll help you, especially if you're a new parent, the reaction that you might have internally will help you take your own temperature. Like based on what they're saying, you might not need to verbalize it during the conversation, but you might be able to feel like, wow, that makes me feel uncomfortable, the fact that they're doing that, or wow, like you were saying, Kelly, I'm surprised they're taking this more seriously than I expected. That's great. So that having that preliminary sort of opening, take the temperature type of question is like sort of the springboard. And then you can sort of say, okay, great. Like, I'm really glad that we opened up, you know, the conversation. Let me think about this a little bit. You think about it too. Let's come back together and like come up with a plan of what can kind of feel safe. And if there's outliers in the family that are sort of like wild cards, you know, that where you know that, you know, they're off doing something that really does not feel good or feel safe for you and your family, I think it's okay to then set more strict limits in that case, or to, like, you know, with those family members say, we're just going to see you from the porch. We're going to say hi. We're going to stay outside, etc. Like, I think it's appropriate to have different limits with different people in the family if it is going to be a big group, or if there's going to be more than just one or two family members. I don't think that you need to feel like everyone needs to be treated equally.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, there was the CDC like highlighted a case over the summer of, I think it was a family in Georgia where like a teenage girl had been exposed in camp and got tested with a PCR test like 3 or 4 days after exposure. So she didn't wait long enough and had the sniffles too. So she was even a little bit symptomatic, and she went to the house and she infected like everybody in the house. But the family members who had come to the family festivities and stayed outside actually didn't get sick. And I think it just goes to show you that those differential behaviors do matter. Like it's a 6 feet away, 15 minutes is just a proxy for like how much virus transfers on average through the air in that time. But the more is more and less is less. And the more distance and the more masking and those things do matter. So it's important to keep it in mind.
Perfect. So we got another question, or we got a bunch of questions, but let's see. I'm just looking for one. So thoughts on bringing a 3-month-old to the holidays with family members coming from other areas. They won't be wearing masks. We are tempted to skip the holidays. Sad face.
So it's one thing I talk about in my book about how you make some of these decisions with newborns, because so for the newborns, so 3 months is almost like on the verge of not being a newborn anymore, right? Hopefully they've gotten their first set of vaccines and they're a little bit stronger and a little bit bigger. But those first 2 months in particular, we consider to be very high risk times for any virus. The flu or an enterovirus or the common cold can spread and cause more severe problems like meningitis or other bacterial infections. So we take it more seriously during that time. And I think in the past, potentially people didn't have like the same awareness that they should have, because these viruses like flu and RSV in years past, 50,000 children on average under the age of 3 months getting hospitalized. Like in the US every year. It's a big problem, these little babies getting sick. So you would think that like, I'm a pediatrician. What did I do with my own kids in the winter? I like locked them in a bubble. I never let them come out. And this is actually like not what I decided to do, because, it's real life and it's about like the benefit and how important it is to you. And, so I had a 10-day-old at Thanksgiving who had actually been in the ICU for trouble breathing for a couple of days, but it was, Thanksgiving, and there were going to be people there who we didn't think were going to come the following year. And it was really important for us to be able to see our family and connect with them, because it had been like a long time we had been trying to have kids, and it was, you want to show off your new baby. And so we found a way to make it feel comfortable for us. Our family actually were pretty good about distancing and masking, even though it wasn't really in vogue yet. And the, family members had flu shots, and we made sure they didn't come if they were feeling iffy. And I didn't really like pass the baby around either. I think with non-mobile children, you do have a little bit more control over how close people get, and how much contact they have. So it's just to say that I think there are options, and I think you should do what you feel comfortable with. And if that's staying home, stay home, absolutely. But if you're really sad about missing it, and you've been struggling in isolation with your new baby and you really want to go, there may be ways to do it in a way that feels safe.
When you made that plan with your family, how did you navigate the conversations? Did you send emails ahead of time, or how did you kind of communicate with your family about how you were thinking about it?
Yeah, I did it by email, and I definitely got some eye rolls and some attitude about it, but I just chose not to let it bother me, because I was too tired probably to care. No, I think at the time it did sting a little, the eye rolls and like, but it's your baby and your baby's wellness. And if it's important, it's important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not their baby, it's your baby, so
Mm-hmm.
I think it was better, even if my family members may have been annoyed at my precautions, I think they were happy we were there and that they got to meet the baby. So
Yeah.
it balances out. So it's kind of like, okay, yes, I understand that you're disappointed that I'm not going to let this be just like a normal visit, that we're going to have these impediments to hanging out normally. But I hope that the benefit of being together, particularly like when we've missed you so much over this period, when we haven't seen you as much, will outweigh like the inconvenience of it.
Right, right. And I think that that's a really good muscle to start building as a new mom, right? Like that's something that's just going to keep coming up in different ways, even outside of the pandemic, right? As a parent. And so, I mean, it's really tough when you're sleep deprived and you're postpartum to be having to think in this way and to deal with any potential eye rolls and whatever snide comments that you're going to get. But I always think about this type of limit setting as really like building this muscle that you need to be a strong mom and to understand that you're making decisions for the sake of your family and for your own sake too, right? And so you still do, if for this person that's asking the question, if it's really important to you to see family and if it's something that you really want, you should be allowed to have that, and you should be allowed to do it in a way that feels good to you and have some say in kind of the terms of that gathering. I think it's also fair to say, though, like you were mentioning, Kelly, like if you're going to end up going and spend the whole time feeling super anxious or worried or scared, and it's important to consider that. And if you're going to be so worried about it the whole time and not be able to actually enjoy yourself, then maybe it's not worth it either. So kind of thinking about, maybe which decision makes you less anxious as well.
Yeah. And, I'm going to ask you a question, which is,
Yeah.
so many, I think part of the reason it's so tough for people is because the consequence feels like so heavy. So do you have advice for people? Like sometimes it is, so say you want your family to mask and they say no. And do you have advice for how people can navigate that feeling of like rejection or disappointment when your family is like not accepting or willing to go with your plan?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think that it feels like a loss, it is kind of a loss, especially if it's a circumstance where it's like, hey, they have the opportunity to see their grandchildren or their little niece or nephew that they really should be excited to see. And you're asking them to do something that feels pretty small and they're pushing back against that. I think that it's really important to recognize that in any new family structure situation, it's always about the power differential. And so this might be a way that people in your family are sort of like fighting the change that's coming or that has come, right? If you're coming in with a new baby, or the younger generation is sort of rising up. I think that can sometimes be helpful to take it a little less personally. Like they're not rejecting you. They're not rejecting your baby. They're rejecting change. They're rejecting the fact that you're asking them to think about the world a little bit differently than they would normally like to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can take the sting out a little bit. The other thing I think it's important to think through before you assert the limit, how you're going to respond if they are a hard no. And I think that's where it's nice to be able to think, if you have a little bit of time before the actual gathering, you can give both sides a period of time to really sort of metabolize the conversation, think about it more, suggest some alternatives if there are alternatives, but eventually know sort of like, what is my hard stop? Is my hard stop going to be the masks in the house? Is my hard stop going to be, okay, we're okay with not doing the masks in the house, but cousin Joey that's like, out gallivanting all over the country, he's not going to be invited in. That's my hard stop, right? So like kind of where's the line?
Yeah, I think it brings up a good point too of like, why would someone say no? And I think it's important sometimes when we navigate these conversations to be understanding that it can come off as judgmental if you're more cautious than your family member. And sometimes I think people can be on guard when they feel judged for their choices, you know, and sometimes people who are being less cautious, they really maybe think they're making the right decision for their family. And so to understand that they may feel that way may help you approach them more with more sensitivity, to be like, I know you guys have a plan and what you've been doing is like working for your family, but we just think about it a little differently because the baby's so little, or my job is really strict about if we're exposed, we can't work for a month, or whatever your excuse for being more cautious is. Not that you need an excuse for your like beliefs and your preferences, but sometimes emphasizing that like you've made your choices for you, not that these are the right choices for everyone, maybe can help people let their guard down a little.
Right, it kind of gives you a little bit of an out. It puts the emphasis on your situation. I think that that's helpful, especially when folks in the family, when everyone's kind of making different decisions. So let me just look and see here. If there's a chance you could be newly pregnant, should you be extra cautious during family get-togethers? For instance, staying with in-laws who could include folks that have been not taking things as seriously.
It's a good question. So the data about coronavirus and pregnancy is limited in terms of what we know about like the long-term outcomes. You know, early in pregnancy, we don't want you getting sick and having a high fever. But that said, you know, coronavirus doesn't look that different for early pregnancy than other viruses like the flu. So I think your precautions should probably be in line with what you would have done otherwise. I do think it's a little different as you approach delivery, like for anybody who might be listening who's in their third trimester. We want to be more cautious about you potentially getting sick around the time of delivery, because that will complicate. You're more likely to get more sick. Although even then, it's probably similar to the flu, but the flu is bad if you're pregnant too. You know, I don't want to minimize the risks of these things. But you don't want to be sick with coronavirus around the time for delivery, both for your own health and the health of the baby that might be at higher risk of getting sick then too.
One of the things that I will say that I've seen in the Facebook group is that, or one thing to consider is that even in early pregnancy, if you do get COVID, the OB offices all have different rules in terms of whether you can come in for your prenatal care. They all have different rules about how, you know, when you can come in after your negative test, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to go to a family gathering and become positive, that's just something to think about. It might affect your prenatal care. So if that's something that would really make you more anxious or stressed, then it could be a little bit of a higher risk for you.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about that.
Does seeing family members in smaller groups help reduce risk if everyone is still getting together as a broader group? We're considering trying to have more one-on-one visits around the holiday instead of doing big get-togethers.
That's an interesting idea. And I can see how that would reduce the risk because there's less chaos. I find when bigger groups gather together, more unpredictable things happen. Sometimes also there's more drinking, and sometimes people's like judgment lapses a little bit if they're drinking. So crowds are also an issue. So if you're in all sitting in one room at one table, there's just like less air per person than if you're doing 3 dinners with the same group, but only 2 at a time. So I do think it probably decreases the risk a little bit if it's feasible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So essentially when you're in a smaller group or when you're one-on-one, your behavior essentially is probably a little bit different and probably a bit safer. So
Mhm.
even though if you're doing one-on-one, those other people that you're seeing are probably still interacting with other folks, but everybody in general is probably being a little bit more safer in the one-on-one interaction than they would have been if everybody was all together.
I imagine like parking 6 feet away from each other rather than like milling around in the kitchen where it's like, when you have
Yeah,
a
right, right. I think the other thing I wanted to just emphasize during this session is just the fact that like making all of these decisions is so tough. And, it can be really tough, especially if you're somebody who has anxiety or is a perfectionist and really wants to constantly try and get things right and have evidence that they are getting things right, where all of this, there's never one clear right answer when it comes to how to make these decisions during the world of COVID. And that's why I love your book so much, because I think you kind of provide parents with sort of a framework from which to make your decisions. But I think we really have to be compassionate with ourselves and give ourselves the time and space to be able to reflect on some of the potential risks and the potential benefits. And like, I love what you said around the fact that this shouldn't just be kind of like one conversation. This should be sort of a process of thinking through all the different scenarios and also really prioritizing like what feels good for me and what's going to feel good for my family, like what's going to be the best possible scenario and then the safest scenario for our kids too, to have the experience that as close to the experience that we'd want them to have over the holidays. And I think also just keeping into perspective that this is 1 year, and fingers crossed next year during the holidays we won't be in quite the same situation.
Oh,
um,
so.
So, because I know that there's some grief there too that people are experiencing right now that kind of can't get together. Even if you are getting together, it's not going to be as freely. There are still all of these anxieties and stresses that are on everyone's minds.
Absolutely. And, for me too, well, I've been reminding parents that they make hard decisions like this all the time, because sometimes I think we forget how many decisions we do make. Parents make decisions about which doctors to see, which vaccines, which school, like all of these complicated decisions all the time. So you can do it. And I think one thing that can really help, I fall into this trap all the time of like comparing my decisions to other people's decisions and then going back and second guessing my decisions. So sometimes I encourage you, once you have a decision or at least a plan, to put your kind of blinders on and try to ignore what other people are doing, because their choices are for their family and their specific situation. And even if you're friends with them, you don't always know all the information. A lot of times you may not know that, the grandfather in that family is really sick and this may be his last Christmas, or that the wife is really depressed and that she has missed her family so much, this is the only thing that would work for them. So other people make decisions for their scenario. You just make decisions for your scenario and try to have confidence in those.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been seeing, especially in mom groups, this hasn't been happening in our Facebook group. I'm happy to say, but in other mom groups where, there's a lot of judgment about the decisions that people make, I think, and you'll see kind of like lashing out around that. And I always say, like, when someone's lashing out about like that, it's about them. It's not about you, right? Something's going on for them. They're really struggling, right? And I think we need to show compassion for each other and just acknowledge, like you said, we don't know what's going on in everyone's lives, in their families. We don't know who's sick. We don't know, the intricacies of what's going on. And so it's just so easy to point the finger and criticize. But I think right now what we really need is to show compassion for ourselves and for other, friends and family members and other parents that are going through this.
Yeah, absolutely. I like compassion for ourselves and for our family members and for our friends. Everybody needs a break.
Just looking to see if there's any other questions that we haven't really touched on. When doing socially distanced activities outside with members that may be participating in riskier behaviors, do you think it's still important to ask everyone to wear masks, even though we're all outside? I think it's still important, right? Like we were just talking about, every little bit actually really helps, and it could result in if somebody, God forbid, were to get sick, that the sickness would be actually less severe with wearing masks, even though you're outside. I don't know, would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. If you have a somebody in your family who really just will not mask, like if you have one of those people, because I've heard they're out there, and you're seeing them outdoors and you can mask, I do think that that's still relatively safe because you control how far away you are from them, and you're outdoors in a well-ventilated area and you have at least some protection. So I think that in that scenario, maybe you could still get together with them relatively safely because you have those other lines of defense. But ideally people who are able to would mask when they're getting together. Just makes it safer.
And I think like one of the things that's tough with that is that it feels like a nuisance, like it feels hard, you know, it's just like another thing that's sort of uncomfortable. It's another thing that reminds us that we're not in normal times. But if we think about it in terms of this is protecting us and this is protecting our family members, like really connecting more with the fact that this actually makes things safer, you know, I think that that helps to be less annoyed with the masks, maybe.
I think it does. I think it's also like the mask enables get-togethers, you know. It's like I think we wanted our kids to go back to school so badly that when they were able to open schools with masks, it was like, thank God for masks, you know, like the mask is the hero of the day to allow this to be safe for our family. But that said, I think one other factor we haven't really talked about is that a lot of these get-togethers involve eating and drinking and time when you may not be masked. And so it's tough, especially in places that are cold. But if you are going to be eating and drinking and having unmasked time together, doing those activities outside is probably safer than doing them inside. Because you know, the length of time close to people without your mask is the risk. So just to consider, you have enough variables to consider already, but another one to consider is like what you'll be doing together, you know. So if it's going to be food related, that's going to be an issue.
That's a really good point. Yeah, we hadn't really talked about that. Well, I'm sure heat lamps will be very hard to find come November.
Yeah, absolutely. And long underwear. And I actually have heard I was talking to my mom today and she was like, you got to do your Christmas shopping early because everybody's going to be buying everything online this year. And you may be like shipping delays. And I was like, oh gosh, another thing to do. Now I'm going to do my Christmas shopping early.
That's funny. Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, I also wanted to take a second to talk about Gemma a little bit and my class. So for those of you who follow me on Instagram, you probably, because I've been posting about it like crazy, you probably heard that I just launched my new company Gemma, which is the first digital education platform exclusively dedicated to women's mental health. And one of the reasons that I started it is because, you know, there's so many classes that you can take to learn how to have a natural childbirth or to learn how to breastfeed your baby or sleep train your baby, but there's nothing focused on moms. And so my mission with Gemma is to create digital courses that are all focused on how moms and women can take care of themselves. So our first course launched last week, and it's all about the triple threat, which is mom guilt, martyr mode, and perfectionism. And I'll share the link with you guys. You can download it. It's only $27, and it's 4 modules that you can work through on your own in depth, and just strategies and tips and actual exercises that you can use in your day-to-day life to figure out how to change your mindset and actually fight back against some of this self-critical thinking that I feel like obviously is coming up so much during the pandemic. And I think like during the holiday time too, with all these big decisions, especially with the perfectionistic type thinking, it can be so easy to get caught up in that mom guilt rat race that's just constantly going.
I'm so glad that you've done that. You know, I think investing the time, it's funny to compare it to some of these other things like breastfeeding, because in investing the time in getting to like a strong mental place will pay off in so many different ways. It will make, you know, sleep training and breastfeeding and baby care and parenting better if you're like, you know, have that fortitude. So I love the idea of women investing the time and energy in preventive mental health care.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but it's all connected, right? And like, that's why I love your work, Kelly, because I feel like you place such a significant emphasis on parental mental health too, and kind of like really always encouraging parents to make sure that they're putting on their oxygen masks first. And I think it's like so easy to disconnect all of the kind of baby performance related stuff from the fact that really the foundation is your mental well-being. You know, like that's the thing that makes everything else possible. Yet moms have no time. There's no time to actually think about yourself or put any time or attention on yourself. So you really have to sort of shift your thinking in the same way that you're practicing some of these skills, or hopefully you'll be practicing some of these skills in having difficult conversations with your family, of setting some of these limits. It's going to feel uncomfortable, but it's all kind of growing that skill set to be able to advocate for yourself, advocate for your family, advocate for your baby. That's going to make you a better mom, ultimately.
Yeah. So often I hear from parents that, you know, we have more of an awareness now of the importance of like social and emotional development in our children. So people are thinking more about that for their kids. Like, how can I raise a child who has a growth mindset and wants to take risks and all that? But sometimes what comes up when I talk to parents about that parenting information is that like that we as parents like don't always practice these things ourselves, and it wasn't really emphasized to talk about our emotions and like these discrete skills, but they are so important. And one of the best ways you can parent them is by modeling them in your own behavior and choices. So I do think it totally pays off for the kids directly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the research definitely supports that too. So it's one of kind of the most important things, your emotional health as a parent, that leads to the best outcomes for kids when it comes to their emotional development, social development, cognitive development, all those fun things. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday night with us. This was amazing. I always learn so much from you. I love how you kind of break down all of this information in a way that's just so easily digestible. And yeah, it's always great to be able to connect with you and spend time with you. So do you want to tell,
glad to have you as a friend.
do you want to tell folks how they can find you also, so they know where to go?
Yeah. So I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Advice I Give My Friends, because that's why I started my account, just giving advice to my friends. And my website, adviceigivemyfriends.com, is the same name, and it has the links to my book, you know, which is available as an audiobook and Kindle book and paperback. So you can find it all there.
Perfect. And I'll share that in the links in the comments too, so people can find it. I love it. Such a great book. I tell all my patients to get it.
Oh, thanks so much for your support.
All right. Well, I hope everybody has a good night, and see you all soon.
Okay, bye, thank you.